collapsed mid-performance. Dick Shawn had spent decades making people laugh in ways that were difficult to categorize. He was not a traditional stand-up comedian, not a straight actor, not a sketch performer in any conventional sense. He was something stranger and more committed than any of those labels suggested. His career stretched back to the 1950s, when he first began appearing in nightclubs and on television, building a reputation as a performer willing to go further than the joke required, to hold a moment past the point of comfort, to let silence do work that other comedians would have filled with noise. He was known for physical commitment, for absurdist premises, for a willingness to subvert the audience's expectations, not just about the punchline, but about the structure of performance itself. By the time the 1980s arrived, Shawn had appeared in films, including a memorable role in It's a Mad, 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 Mad World, had performed on Broadway, and had continued touring with the one-man show format he had refined over years of live performance. On April 17, 1987, Shawn was performing at the University of California, San Diego. The venue was a campus theater, the kind of space with tiered seating and good sightlines, filled that evening with an audience that had come specifically to see him. The crowd was not a passive one. They knew Shawn's reputation. They knew that what looked like an accident might be a choice, that what appeared to be failure might be the point, that the line between performer and performance was something Shawn treated as a suggestion, rather than a boundary. The show proceeded through its material. Shawn was deep into his act when he fell forward onto the stage. He went down without a sound that registered as alarm. He went down the way a man might fall if falling were the next thing written in the script. The audience laughed. This is confirmed in multiple accounts of that evening. The laughter was not cruel. It was the laughter of a crowd that had been trained by the performer himself to distrust the obvious interpretation. Shawn had spent his career teaching audiences that the thing that looked real might be a construction, and that the thing that looked like a construction might be real. On the night of April 17th, that training worked against him completely. He remained on the stage floor. The act did not continue. The music did not shift. The performer did not rise. The audience continued to wait. Accounts vary on exactly how many minutes passed before the uncertainty in the room began to consolidate into something else. What is confirmed is that several minutes elapsed. People watched. Some still laughed. Some stopped laughing and watched more carefully. The specific moment when the collective understanding shifted is not recorded, but it did shift. Someone moved toward the stage. Others followed. What they found was a man who had collapsed from a heart attack, prompting a rapid medical response that rushed him to a nearby hospital, where he was later pronounced dead. Emergency responders were contacted. The venue, a university campus, had medical resources nearby. Responders arrived rapidly and worked on Shawn right there on the stage before the transfer could take place. The full timeline of those attempts is not in the public record, and exact details of what was tried and for how long were not publicly disclosed. What was disclosed is that the attempts were unsuccessful. Dick Shawn was 63 years old. He was pronounced dead. The cause of death was a heart attack. The audience that watched him fall had no way of knowing in the moment that they were watching the last thing he would ever do on a stage. The act they thought they were seeing was not an act. Millions watched live. Tommy Cooper was one of the most recognized comedians in Britain. His career had run for decades through the middle of the 20th century, built on a specific and immediately identifiable persona. He wore a fez. He performed magic tricks that failed in ways that were more precisely controlled than any trick that succeeded. The failures were not accidents. They were constructions of extraordinary precision, timed and paced and calibrated to produce a specific quality of laughter. The laughter that comes from watching someone apparently incompetent operate with total confidence. Cooper had performed this act across British television for years, had appeared on nearly every major variety program the country produced, and had become, by the 1980s, not merely a famous comedian, but something closer to a national institution. On April 15, 1984, Cooper was one of the performers appearing on Live from Her Majesty's, a variety program broadcast on ITV. The show was produced at Her Majesty's Theatre in London, one of the older and more formally appointed theatres in the West End, a venue with a long history of variety performance and a capacity that filled the room with a substantial seated audience. The broadcast was live. There was no delay. What the studio audience saw, the television audience saw simultaneously. Cooper took the stage during the broadcast and moved through his act. He was in a long robe, which was itself part of the performance, a costume element consistent with some of his stage work. The audience in the theater was engaged. The at-home audience was watching. At some point during the act, Cooper sat down, or appeared to sit down, or collapsed into a sitting and then a prone position. The witnesses in the theater and the viewers at home saw a large man go down in a way that was consistent with a Tommy Cooper bit. He was a performer whose entire professional identity was built on the controlled appearance of losing control. The audience laughed. The laughter is documented. It is part of the broadcast record, which exists and has been reviewed. Cooper did not get up. A woman who was performing with him that evening was nearby on stage. She moved toward him. Other people moved toward him. The moment when the performance stopped being a performance was visible on camera, though the precise second is difficult to identify because the transition from act to emergency was gradual. Cooper was moved backstage. He was not able to be revived at the theater. He was transported to Westminster Hospital in London. The specific timeline of transport and hospital arrival is not fully detailed in the public record. Medical teams at the hospital were unable to save him. Tommy Cooper was 63 years old. He was pronounced dead. The cause of death was a heart attack. The broadcast in which he died was live, carried into homes across Britain in real time. The audience in the theater and the audience watching from their living rooms had laughed as he collapsed. Most of them did not know while they were laughing that they were watching him die. Sanford's last scene. Red Foxx had one of the longest and most varied careers in American comedy. He started in the 1940s performing on the Chitlin Circuit, the network of venues that served black audiences in a segregated entertainment industry. He recorded dozens of comedy albums through the 1950s and 60s, albums that circulated widely but were considered too explicit for mainstream radio. He was a working comedian for more than 20 years before the role that changed his public profile arrived. In 1972, Foxx was cast as Fred Sanford in Sanford and Son, a sitcom produced for NBC. The show ran for 6 seasons and made Foxx one of the most recognized comedic performers on American television. His character, a cantankerous junk dealer in the Watts neighborhood of Los Angeles, had a recurring bit that became one of the most well-known physical comedy routines in the history of the medium. When Fred Sanford wanted to avoid a confrontation or manipulate a situation or simply get out of something he did not want to do, he would clutch his chest, look skyward, and announce that he was having a heart attack. He would call out to his deceased wife Elizabeth, tell her he was coming to join her. The audience laughed every time. The bit worked because the performance was completely committed and completely transparent at once. By 1991, Foxx was working on a new sitcom called The Royal Family, produced for CBS. He was cast alongside Della Reese. Production was underway in Hollywood, California, and the cast and crew were in the rhythm of regular rehearsal days. On October 11, 1991, Foxx was on the set of The Royal Family during a rehearsal session. Cast members were present. Crew members were present. Della Reese was on set. The work of the day was underway. Foxx collapsed. The accounts of the immediate witness reaction include the detail that some people present, seeing a man clutch his chest and go down on a television set, thought of Fred Sanford. The collapse looked, in the first moments, like something Red Fox's most famous character had done dozens of times on camera. The reference was available to everyone in that room. It was part of the air of the moment. He was not performing. Emergency services were contacted. Foxx was transported from the set to Queen of Angels Hollywood Presbyterian Medical Center. The specific timeline of transport of what was attempted at the scene and what was attempted at the hospital is not fully detailed in the public record. Exact medical interventions were not publicly disclosed. Red Foxx died on the evening of October 11, 1991. He was 68 years old. The cause of death was a heart attack. The cast and crew who had been present on the set that day had watched a man collapse and in the first moments had not known whether it was a man or a character falling down. Final standing ovation. Eric Morecambe was half of Morecambe and Wise, the comedy duo that had defined a particular era of British entertainment. He and Ernie Wise had been performing together since the 1940s, had moved through music hall, radio, and into television, and by the 1960s and 70s had become the most watched double act in British broadcasting. Their Christmas specials, produced for the BBC and later for ITV, drew audiences in the tens of millions. In a country where television had a limited number of channels and the culture of shared viewing was still largely intact, Morecambe and Wise were not simply popular, they were a fixture. Eric Morecambe was also a man with a documented history of heart disease. He had survived a heart attack in 1968 and had undergone cardiac surgery. He continued performing through the 1970s and into the 80s, and those who worked with him were aware that his health was a consideration. He continued regardless. On May 28, 1984, Morecambe was performing at the Roses Theatre in Tewkesbury, England. The Roses Theatre was a mid-sized venue, the kind of regional theatre that hosted touring productions and solo performances, a building with a stage and raked seating and the particular quality of attention that smaller venues produce in their audiences. The show that evening, a live question and answer session hosted by a close friend, was a success. The audience responded with enthusiasm throughout. At the end of the performance, Morecambe took his curtain calls. The audience gave him a standing ovation. He stood on the stage and received it. He was 58 years old, and he had just completed a successful performance in front of an audience that was on its feet. He walked off the stage, having playfully rushed back out to join the band and play the instruments for 6 final curtain calls. He stepped toward the wings for the final time and collapsed. It was right there at the edge of the stage, still within the residual energy of the performance and steps from the lights, that he collapsed. People who were backstage responded immediately. Emergency services were contacted. Morecambe was transported to Cheltenham General Hospital. The distance between Tewkesbury and Cheltenham is short, and transport would have been rapid. Medical teams at the hospital worked to stabilize him. Those efforts were unsuccessful. Eric Morecambe died in the early hours of May 29, 1984. He was 58 years old. The cause of death was a heart attack. The last thing he did in a professional context was walk out onto a stage and receive a standing ovation from an audience that loved him. The last thing the audience saw was a man taking his bow. Interval never returned. Leonard Rossiter built his career on precision. He was known among directors and co-performers as a technically demanding actor and comedian, someone who tracked timing with an exactness that could exhaust the people around him. He had been trained in theater and had moved through stage work and into television, where he found the roles that made him a recognizable name across British households. His performances as Rigsby in Rising Damp and as Reginald Perrin in The Fall and Rise of Reginald Perrin were not the performances of a comedian who improvised his way through a scene. They were the product of a performer who knew exactly what he was doing at every moment. By 1984, Rossiter was appearing on stage in London in a production of Loot, the black comedy written by Joe Orton. The play was running at the Lyric Theatre in the West End, a venue with a history going back to the 1880s, a mid-sized house with a formal interior and the particular atmospheric quality of a theatre that has hosted a great many things. Rossiter was the lead. The production was drawing audiences. On October 5th, 1984, the Lyric Theatre had a full or near-full house for the evening performance of Loot. The first act proceeded. The interval arrived, the standard pause in the middle of a theatrical performance where the house lights come up, the audience moves to the bars and the lobbies, and the performers return to their dressing rooms. Rossiter went to his dressing room. He collapsed there, in his dressing room, during the interval. The audience was in the theater. They were in the lobby, at the bar, in their seats, waiting for the second act. They did not know what was happening backstage. The interval is a suspended moment in any theatrical evening, a pause that holds the audience between what they have seen and what they are about to see. On October 5th, the second act of Loot would not begin, transforming the empty stage into a sudden, silent void right in front of the waiting audience. The people who discovered Rossiter in his dressing room contacted emergency services. He was transported from the Lyric Theatre to a hospital. Medical teams assessed him and worked to stabilize his condition. Those efforts could not succeed. Leonard Rossiter was 57 years old. He was pronounced dead. The cause of death was hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, a condition of the heart muscle. The audience at the Lyric Theatre that evening eventually learned that the show would not continue. The performer they had come to watch had died in his dressing room, while they waited in the lobby for the lights to go down again. Live and unscripted. Tiny Tim occupied a strange and specific place in American entertainment. His real name was Herbert Corey. He had worked for years on the fringes of the music and comedy worlds before a series of television appearances in the late 1960s brought him to a vast mainstream audience. His signature performance was the song Tiptoe Through the Tulips, delivered in a high falsetto that he accompanied on a ukulele. He was tall and thin, with long dark hair, and the combination of his physical appearance, his vocal register, and his apparent earnestness produced a reaction in audiences that sat somewhere between delight and bewilderment. He was understood, broadly, as a novelty act, a figure of comedy by virtue of existing in a way that resisted easy categorization. His most famous single moment of public visibility came in December of 1969, when he married a woman known publicly as Miss Vicky on The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson. The ceremony was broadcast live. 40 million people watched. It was one of the highest-rated Tonight Show episodes in the program's history. By the 1990s, Tiny Tim was performing at smaller venues. His mainstream moment had passed, but he continued to work, appearing at events and engagements that sought his particular quality of performance. His age at this point is a matter of some dispute in the public record, with different sources assigning different birth years. This outline notes that dispute and does not resolve it. He was in his 60s. On November 30th, 1996, Tiny Tim was performing at the Women's Club of Minneapolis. The event was a gala benefit, the kind of formal fundraising occasion held in a large room with tables and a stage and an audience that had paid to attend. He had appeared at this kind of event before. He took the stage and began performing. He was playing Tiptoe Through the Tulips, having just completed the performance of that song, the one most associated with him, the one he had sung on national television in front of tens of millions of people. Tiny Tim was being assisted back to his table by his wife when he collapsed. People near the stage moved toward him immediately. He was assisted and removed from the performance area. The audience in the room witnessed the collapse and the response. Emergency services were contacted. Tiny Tim was transported to Hennepin County Medical Center in Minneapolis. Medical teams at the hospital received him and worked to address his condition. The specific details of what was attempted and for how long are not in the detailed public record, and exact medical interventions were not publicly disclosed. Tiny Tim was pronounced dead. The cause of death was heart failure. His age at the time of death is listed differently in different sources, a discrepancy that originates in conflicting records of his birth year. He collapsed just moments after performing the song that had defined his public identity, falling in front of the very audience that had come to see him perform it. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.